Hypocrisy. It's a dirty word. It's a dirty word inside of Christian circles and even outside of them. No one likes a hypocrite. Even secular people who have no concept of sort of the Christian definition of a hypocrite can't work with people like that. But for Christians, it's basically the ultimate form of evil. So today I'd like to look into that subject in an ongoing study of the introduction to Joshua chapter 2. This is Eric Slawick, aka the WM Pen Guy, and this is the Bible commentary. As always, if you like what you're seeing, then I would ask that you hit like and subscribe to help the channel grow. And now without further ado, let's get into the Word. So having in the last video kind of accidentally or providentially produced what I want to now become the primary gospel video to introduce the entire channel and all its series, and maybe by the time you watch this that will have changed, but it's where I'm headed right now. Let's kind of branch off of that into the question of hypocrisy, because in Joshua chapter 2 we see the opposite of a hypocrite. Now, in the last video, I suggested that Rahab was an extraordinarily unlikely choice in the minds of people in that day and in Jewish culture for salvation. Now, the contrast, and I want to make it clear, this isn't a particular beef I have with Judaism or anything. God set up this nation and allowed it to decay and collapse into this grotesque form of external, hypocritical, shallow, empty religion, specifically to illustrate how corrosive and deadly hypocrisy really is. There are many other things he illustrated, but this is definitely one of them. So I'll begin this by again putting up that very important, very famous verse that man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. Now, this is the prophet Samuel speaking of King David versus King Saul. And if you'd like to go in more depth into the question of the hypocrite Saul and the man after God's own heart, David, I put up a whole series called The Leadership Study at the end of Joshua chapter 1 that I do sort of an overview of both of those characters. It's dealing with a question of kind of political philosophy, but it has a lot of Venn diagram overlap with this question here. Now, it's a very important principle illustrated throughout the scriptures, because at that time you had Saul the hypocrite, David the man after God's own heart, but that theme had already existed. For example, you could go back to Jacob and Esau as another illustration of this, but one which also illustrates the divine irony and inversion that God often puts upon our natural expectations. Rahab was an extraordinarily unlikely choice. God inverted people's expectations by choosing a whore for salvation to be in the line of the Messiah himself. She's listed, I think, in both genealogies, but at least in one of the two in Matthew and Luke. Now, here with Jacob and Esau, everything would lead you to believe that Esau was the man who was going to be God's man. He's the strong man. He's the man's man. He's the man that's fixing things, and he's the superhero type. And Esau's the prissy mama's boy. And really at the beginning, there's nothing to really show the difference between these two. In fact, Jacob's basically worse because he's a hypocrite. Because both of them are kind of maneuvering for the birthright, which was the blessing God was going to give to one of them to be the line of Messiah and the one who would receive all the benefits of the covenant that God had made with Abraham and Isaac and now with one of them. And God had told Rebekah, Isaac's wife, the boy's mother, that the older shall serve the younger. Esau was the older, Jacob was the younger. The order in that culture was that it was what they call primogeniture, that basically the oldest sibling receives everything and everyone else basically receives whatever's left over. And this reversed the order. And then on top of that, you have, when they're maneuvering for this, Jacob is lying to his father to try to receive the blessing in the name of God, where Esau, at least as corrupted as he was just what he was. He was just a worldly man, very much on the surface. So really, Jacob was the less likely candidate in terms of human value, though it's really kind of a toss-up from another perspective. And yet, God says in Malachi, and Paul quotes this in Romans 9, as I believe he did the one about the elder serving the younger, Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. Now, I put up another video, I believe, about God having wrath, and I think I may have put up one about God hating people. But here I'll just say that when it says God hates someone, it's not in the sense that we think of it. It's in the sense that it's like God's love. God's love is defined in 1 Corinthians 13. It's all actions, which can bring along emotion, but it's fundamentally about choices that you make. It's a verb rather than an adjective or a noun. And it's the same thing with his hatred. Don't think of it like our hatred. Think of it more in the sense of God chooses not to bless someone. He chooses to punish them, which, as I said in the last video, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. We all deserve nothing but God's wrath anyway, so it's perfectly just for God to choose to then give someone what they deserve. So, all of this to say that hypocrisy is corrosive. Jacob was a vile character, and when you bring this up into New Testament times, Jesus has some rather unpleasant things to say about hypocrites. And he makes it clear that this wasn't the first time in their history this was happening. In Isaiah chapter 1, I'll put up a big block quote here, which I don't normally do, but I think it's valuable here, where I'm just going to read it. Bring no more vain offerings. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath and the calling of convocations. I cannot endure iniquity in the solemn assembly. Your new moons and your appointed feasts my soul hates. They become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. This is pretty stark language. And it illustrates just what God thinks about hypocrisy. It basically implies that the things that a hypocrite brings are worthless. They're insufferable to God. God won't hear the hypocrite's prayers, except, of course, for the prayer of salvation, should they repent. And it's just the same ritual over and over and over again. It's worthless. It's worse than worthless in many ways because, as I'll demonstrate in a second, then people who have this practice this hypocrisy have convinced themselves that this mere external worthlessness is some sort of substitute for genuine salvation, and that this external righteousness can replace the genuine righteousness that is required to enter into heaven, which only Christ himself, of course, has ever had. And you can only have it for yourself by having it imputed or credited to your account by grace alone, through faith alone. So that's pretty stark. But then we can go up to New Testament times and see they've learned nothing. And in fact, Jesus quotes from this same book of Isaiah and applies it to the Pharisees that 7 centuries later they'd learned nothing. They'd actually gotten worse. And in Matthew chapter 23, he spends a long time condemning these hypocritical leaders for their hypocrisy and their lies and their evil, and they're using their false religion as a cloak for wickedness, as Peter would phrase it. And he says to them, you're like woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. You're like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. Wow, this is pretty stark. This is heavy language. And I want to make it clear that this is a fundamental condition of many people today, but it's not something you can evenly divide across denominational lines or something that simple. There are hypocrites in every tradition and every church. And in almost every church, there are genuinely born-again people. The proportion of that will vary from church to church, but this is talking about the basic level of people who have heard the gospel, or even the gospel with a lot of tradition added onto it, but the gospel's still buried in there somewhere. The message of salvation, even in this Phariseeism, was still buried inside of it. And so my plea today would be that if you have heard this or heard other preaching or read the word and you're afraid you might be a hypocrite, Paul says examine yourselves to see if you're in the faith. Make sure you're not a hypocrite, because hypocrites are doomed. Hypocrites are going to be in hell. But if you think you are, there's obviously hope. Today is the day of salvation, and so I would encourage you to turn to Christ for real. And so until next time then, this is Eric Slawick, the UWM Penn guy, and this has been the Bible Commentary.